Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome.
Sveiki.
First of all, a brief announcement before we move to point 11 of the agenda is a practical announcement that the coffee will be served outside or just at the entrance because due to the strike we are suffering. So we directly move on to the point 11 of the agenda, the hearing on the fight against tax evasion, FATCA, as a first step toward international automatic exchange information.
Sākam ar pirmo jautājumu, tas ir FATCA jautājums. Un Klemats kundze nāks klajā ar pirmo paziņojumu. Esam uzaicinājuši 5 runātājus. Vēlētos īpaši pateikties Robertam Stāka kungam un Paskālam Santamanam. Un tātad 5 eksperti ir sekojošie Roberts Staks, Paskāls Santamans, Filips Kermoda, Maiks Lūis un Mērija Rozvola. Esat laipni aicināti, došu vārdu Robertam Stakam, kas atbilst par starptautiskiem nodokļu jautājumiem ASV Finanšu departamentā. Jums vārds uz 5 minūtēm. Liels paldies! Tik uzaicināts uzstāties šodien jūsu komitejā. Man ir sagatavota runa.
The United States Treasury Department has continued to ramp up efforts to promote global tax transparency. The U.S. Treasury has been working with governments and financial institutions to implement the information reporting and withholding tax provisions commonly known as the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, or FATCA. Enacted by the United States Congress in 2010, FATCA targets U.S. taxpayers who use foreign accounts to avoid paying U.S. taxes. Here are some ways that the United States Treasury is working to ensure effective implementation of FATCA. First, global cooperation and intergovernmental agreements. In order to effectively combat offshore tax evasion, global cooperation is critical. To that end, the United States Treasury Department has published 2 model intergovernmental agreements, or IGAs, that serve as a basis for concluding bilateral agreements with jurisdictions to implement FATCA. Treasury has been working to streamline the process of entering into an IGA so that any interested jurisdiction may enter into an IGA prior to January 1st, 2014. The Treasury Department is currently engaged with more than 75 jurisdictions and has already concluded bilateral agreements with the United Kingdom, Denmark, Mexico, Ireland, Switzerland, and Norway, and has initialed bilateral agreements with Spain, Italy, and Germany. Moving forward, Treasury will continue to engage willing partners worldwide to ensure implementation of FATCA. We published final regulations. Earlier this year, Treasury and the Internal Revenue Service issued comprehensive final FATCA regulations that provide certainty for governments and financial institutions by finalizing the step-by-step process for U.S. account identification, information reporting, and withholding requirements for foreign financial institutions and other foreign entities, as well as U.S. withholding agents. Finally, the United States welcomes the statement of the European Council released May 22nd to the effect that broadening the scope of automatic exchange of information at all levels will be taken forward by the Council as a matter of priority. And we endorse the pilot project recommended by the 17 members with respect to multilateral automatic exchange of information launched by these member states and endorsed by several others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stack. We will move on to the second guest of this afternoon, and is Mr. Pascal Sanama, Director of the Center for Tax Policy and Administration of the OECD. So we give the floor to Mr. San Ama for 5 minutes via video conference.
Yes, hello, and good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. It's an honor for the OECD to be invited to speak. I do need to point out that unfortunately Mr. Pascal Saint-Amand had a last-minute emergency, which is the reason that I'm stepping in for him. I am Achim Proste, Head of Division responsible for exchange of information within the OECD. I will give you a high-level overview briefly of what the OECD is doing in the area of automatic exchange of information. Before I do, you're certainly aware of the work that we're doing on information exchange upon request, which has become the international standard and is being reviewed by our global forum, which now I think has up to 120 members. But then concentrating on automatic exchange of information, let me start by saying that we work extremely closely with the EU on these matters. The EU is present in all of our meetings, and that is important, and we coordinate very, very closely with respect to technical standards where we have compatible formats for the transmission of the information, and that is an important feature of our respective work. We did in 2012 do a report on automatic exchange of information and the status of automatic exchange of information for the G20 when the leaders met in July in Los Cabos. That gives you a snapshot of where we stand on automatic exchange of information. It highlights that there is a lot of automatic exchange of information that is already happening both within the EU but also outside the EU. Denmark, for instance, is currently the world leader in automatic exchange of information, exchanging with up to 75 countries already. Given the increased importance that is attached to automatic exchange of information as a tool to deal with the critical issue of fighting offshore tax evasion, we at the OECD have also increased our efforts to develop a secure, standardized, and effective model for automatic exchange of information on financial accounts. And key in this effort is that we design a system that is global, so that tax evaders can't avoid it by moving from A to B, that it avoids unnecessary costs that would result from a proliferation of incompatible systems, and 3, that it is designed with the needs of residence countries in mind, and that may entail covering corporate entities as account holders so that tax evaders can't interpose entities and avoid being reported. And of course it also covers aspects such as a broad range of products and investment opportunities so that tax evaders can't circumvent the system by moving out of one product into another financial product. As you will have seen when the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors met in April in Washington, they asked us, the OECD, working together with G20 countries, to report back to them on progress in developing a, and I quote, new multilateral standard on automatic exchange of information. You will also be aware that the G8 presidency has asked us for a report on developing automatic exchange in a multilateral context. And as you've just heard also from Bob Stark, there's been much momentum also in this space as a result of a pilot commenced by a number of EU member countries. Now, we at OECD are very advanced, and we're optimistic to be able to meet the tight timelines of the G20. We are drawing in our work, of course, on FATCA Model 1, in particular IGA. but of course also taking into account what already exists so we don't reinvent the wheel in the context of the EU, for instance, but also in disciplines such as anti-money laundering. We are having a next meeting coming up in June, bringing together OECD and G20 countries, and hope to have a system that is both global, meets the demands of governments around the world, but at the same time keeps compliance costs to a minimum to the benefit of governments and financial institutions alike. Thank you very much for spending the time listening to my intervention.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Pros, and I apologize. I called you Mr. Sanaman, but we were not aware that Mr. Sanaman was not there. So we will give the floor now to Mr. Philip Kermore, Director of DG Taxot of the European Commission, for 5 minutes. Mr. Kermore.
Thank you very much, Chair, honourable members, fellow speakers. The Commission is very pleased that automatic exchange of information is gaining widespread support as the standard of cooperation to be applied between tax administrations. As you know, the EU has been a pioneer in recognising the value of automatic information exchange as a tool in the hands of tax administrations to fight against cross-border tax fraud and evasion. Indeed, EU member states have been exchanging financial information automatically since 2005 under the EU Savings Directive. And that directive, together with its network of international agreements, has been operating for some 80 years. And indeed, the underlying IT system has also been put in place to allow this exchange to take place and has been operating successfully over time. In fact, at present, the Savings Directive represents the most comprehensive multilateral automatic exchange system in the tax area in the world. In addition, and I think it's important to remember this, that the EU directives on administrative cooperation foresee further automatic exchange of information on 5 categories of income and capital from January 2015, where the information is available. The Commission is in the process of developing the necessary practical IT systems that will underpin this. So the message here is that there is an ongoing process, and indeed the Commission welcomes the recent call by the European Council for rapid progress in extending automatic information exchange both at EU and at global levels. And here I think I mirror the comments that were made by the American representative. We also welcome the initiative launched initially by 5 member states and supported by many others subsequently to work on a pilot automatic information exchange facility. This initiative clearly shows that there is now a strong consensus among member states on the need to make progress in automatic information exchange. Indeed, the Commission now intends to come forward in the next few weeks with a further proposal to strengthen the provisions on automatic exchange of information under the Directive on Administrative Cooperation. This expansion of this directive, combined with the adoption of the revised Savings Directive, which the Commission hopes will happen before the end of the year, would in fact bring the scope of information exchange within the EU entirely into line with the standards that would apply if the FATCA agreements were fully in force. Indeed, if you take the total of the exchange of information involved, it would in some cases actually surpass that. But I think what matters is the quality of the system as well. The agreements that Member States are concluding with the US regarding FATCA may, of course, require them to provide an equivalent level of cooperation to each other under the most favoured nation provision in the Directive on Administrative Cooperation. And here there is a risk that uncoordinated bilateral or multilateral agreements between the Member States could lead to distortions that could be detrimental to the smooth functioning of the internal market. Therefore, an EU-wide initiative would provide a solid EU legal basis for enhanced automatic information exchange within the EU and would ensure a consistent and coherent approach, as is the case with the existing EU arrangements on automatic information exchange. At the international level, the Commission strongly supports the efforts being made in the G8, the G20 and indeed the OECD to promote automatic exchange of information on a global basis and to develop a form of global standard per se. The EU has accumulated extensive experience in the area of automatic exchange of information, as is implicit in what I said earlier, on the basis of its already functioning systems of automatic exchange. It's therefore essential that the EU standards and expertise are duly considered in the design and development of any new global standards, which should be compatible with the existing standards of automatic information exchange. And here I take up on the point made by our colleague Achim Pross in the OECD. It's important that these things are compatible to minimise burdens and keep costs as low as possible for tax administrations and economic operators. Finally, I think I would like to echo a point again made by Mr. Achim Pross, and that is the importance in working on a global standard that the EU and the OECD should continue to work together, not only on the wider issue of a definition of automatic exchange of information, but also on ensuring that the mechanisms that are used can all be compatible. So I do believe that working together we can develop a truly efficient system that can be managed and operated properly by tax administrations and economic operators. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kermode. I will give the floor now to Mr. Luis, Policy Advisor at Action Aid, a member of Eurodat. Please, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My organisation is extremely grateful for the opportunity to speak with the committee at a time of huge opportunity and also, I think, some risk in the fight against tax evasion and avoidance. As you said, I work for the international development organisation Action Aid, active in 8 European countries and 37 other countries around the world, and we work within Eurodad, a Europe-wide network of civil society organisations mobilising on these issues. We probably have most to say in that respect on the second part of your hearing, that's to say the role of FATCA in promoting further automatic exchange of tax-related information more widely around the world. Our organisations have long campaigned for an automatic information exchange standard that all countries, including developing countries, can join, and that tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions will join. We have high hopes that the second part of this goal will be furthered by the expanding endorsement of a FATCA-based automatic information exchange standard across the EU and member state endorsement of the standard as a global one. And it is particularly significant in this regard that there is the possibility of the UK's Crown dependencies and overseas territories, for example, participating in the recently announced pilot information exchange facility. Opening up financial institution data from these secretive jurisdictions would be, in our view, extremely significant. We'd like to draw the committee's attention to 3 potential stumbling blocks to the emerging FATCA standard delivering meaningful benefits outside of the European Union and outside of the G20. And I think these are all stumbling blocks that are uppermost in the minds of those at the OECD and elsewhere who are working to make this standard a genuinely global one. First, both bilateral US FATCA agreements and the emerging Big Five European FATCA deal rely, of course, upon the economic weight and the political clout of large economies to compel secrecy jurisdictions to participate. Since these bilateral and multilateral deals so far leave all non-G20 countries, including developing countries, out in the cold, there is a risk, I think, that the automatic information exchange standard stops at the boundaries of the European Union, with little incentive for European and North American powers to push for secrecy jurisdictions to exchange information multilaterally and automatically with other countries too. And there's a danger that we think that this could lead to a two-tier system in which developing countries in particular are stuck with a lower standard of information exchange and with information exchange instruments that don't include tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions. So as Member States and the Commission move forward with administrative and legislative proposals, we believe it's important that they commit not only to the pilot Big Five facility becoming a union-wide initiative, but also that they explicitly aim to bring in the participation of other treaty partners of Member States too, including developing countries. Secondly, if the FATCA and the emerging European deals are to develop into a platform that is genuinely globally accessible, then the standard on which they are based needs to support developing countries' access to the information stream without necessarily the burdens of immediate reciprocation. Many developing country tax authorities do not have the capacities for immediate reciprocation, and asymmetry for developing country partners is already an accepted principle in some other areas of international cooperation, including trade. We believe it should be an accepted principle in tax information exchange as well. Of course, in order to prevent the creation of new secrecy jurisdictions, such asymmetry should be time-bound and limited to countries whose own financial institutions have fairly small cross-border deposits. It should also be the case that the requisite capacity building and assistance is put in place to allow those jurisdictions not subject to immediate reciprocation to join full reciprocation within a given time period, and we know that that is already on the agenda of the OECD, of the UN Tax Committee, and in other places as well, and we're very grateful for that. Thirdly, while the automatic provision of information about taxpayers' overseas income and financial assets would undoubtedly be valuable for many developing countries, there is a second variety, a second flavour of information exchange that is particularly valuable for developing countries and should not be forgotten about. That's the sharing between tax authorities of targeted dossiers of tax-related information, perhaps from a particular audit or about a particular category of taxpayers, which has relevance to another country and potentially leading to activities like joint or simultaneous audits. This kind of broader and deeper international tax cooperation can yield startling rewards. It's the kind of cooperation that is provided for example, under the information exchange provisions of the Multilateral Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters. It's significant that no non-EU tax haven has yet signed this convention, and tax havens will be under even less pressure to sign it as wealthy economies move on to a FATCA-based information exchange platform. And so we believe we should take care that the race towards a global FATCA, valuable though it is, does not take the wind out of efforts to get tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions to sign up to this kind of deeper international tax cooperation too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Luis. And finally, we will give the floor to Mrs. Mary Rosval, President of the Fiscal Committee of the European Banking Federation. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to, on behalf of EBF, thank you for inviting us here today to take part in this hearing and giving us an opportunity to express our views on today's very important subjects. When FATCA was passed through US legislative process a couple of years ago, the European banks and other financial institutions very rapidly realized the enormous implications this US initiative would have on them. From a democratic and legal perspective, the unilateral approach adopted by the US was very much criticized. Indeed, how can one country impose its law on other countries around the world without any consultations or discussions? For taxpayers in Europe, the democratic process should normally require that a bilateral agreement, ideally based on the OECD standards, is entered into by the legislative country and their home country as well. As from the start, the European Banking Federation, who represent more than 4,500 banks in Europe, provided its member banks with a forum to discuss FATCA. The EBF immediately engaged the US Treasury as well as the Internal Revenue Service to discuss the implementation of FATCA and not least the necessary related guidance. It very soon emerged from the first analysis on FATCA that the requested transfer of sensitive personal information to US tax authorities would conflict with EU and domestic law. So the common efforts and the work has led to where we are today, the signing of IGAs. However, up until now, as was mentioned before, less than 10 agreements have been signed. And given the implementation timeframe proposed or imposed on banks, we are deeply concerned about the slow pace at which this is progressing. According to the standard model, financial institutions are indeed requested to have the systems in place by the end of December this year. Since we don't know yet the details on what to implement, I would say that FATCA is currently the most challenging implementation issue for European banks, and we strongly believe that the timeline must be pushed forward in order to make it possible for European banks to comply. As we heard, there are two different models, the Model 1 and the Model 2. We expect that most European countries will sign the Model 1, which means that we will give the information directly to the local tax authorities instead of the IRS, and the local tax authorities will then pass it on to the United States. We believe in future work on developing and improving automatic exchange agreements. This should be the general principle. From an administrative perspective, the implementation of FATCA based on the Model 1 will require banks to comply with two major requirements. The first one is to go through existing customer databases in order to find customers with US indicia, that is, US addresses, phone numbers, standing transfer to US, and so on. The second requirement is to have comprehensive onboarding process in place in order to identify any US tax residents when becoming a client in a certain bank, as well as making sure that we have systems in place so that we can identify any changes in the customer personal files. This is a major challenge for financial institutions. Indeed, we have had to invest huge amounts of work into massive projects and had to incur huge costs for also changing the item systems as well as building new functions into the existing systems. One might think that banks have only one system in place to take care of all the customer relationship, but this is very rarely the case. From a legal perspective, the following concerns and experiences should be mentioned. Within the European Union, banks already have systems in place in order to comply with the Savings Tax Directive, as we heard. According to statistics from the Commission, more than 3.7 million records were exchanged during 2010. And then there's also the Directive on Mutual Assistance on Taxes. Again, in 2010, about 3.4 million records were exchanged on the basis of this directive. First, I would like to emphasize the need to take into consideration the existing legislation when developing new standards and requirements. It is essential that dual reporting is avoided, as this will only bring about more unnecessary costs for banks and by their customers. It is also essential that any internal relationship between the current directives and any future FATCA agreements is perfectly clear from a legal perspective, and here, of course, the Commission plays a vital role. My second remark relates to a cost versus benefit perspective. Policymakers may want to increase the exchange of information between countries. However, it is questionable that the tax authorities in countries will have the capacity to go through and evaluate the information overload. I've mentioned the figures for 2010, and this is just what we are facing up with today. As a concluding remark, I would like to suggest that policymakers take time to reflect on the basic principles that should govern the information exchange for tax purposes. What about a risk-based approach, whereby only the information that is relevant from a tax evading perspective would be transferred? If governments go the path of the FATCA approach, the volume of the information exchange will keep on increasing dramatically, perhaps making policymakers feel comfortable with that very fact and disregarding the fact that the information which is useful is drowned into a massive flow of data and cannot be dealt with by local tax administrations. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Roswell. Now we'll have a joint debate with members of this committee. I will first give the floor to the shadow rapporteur of the EPP, Mrs. Pitcairn.
Thank you. And on my behalf, thank you for all of the speakers for a very useful and valuable and interesting points of view, because I indeed feel that we are moving to the point where instead of only talking about better tax administration, we are taking concrete steps. And if I may, I would like to underline a couple of the points that I find important and crucial according to the discussions what we have had here in the Parliament. And if possible, I would like to have at some point some reflection by the speakers on those issues. And actually I would start from the point where our last speaker concluded and where quite a number of you have referred already, and this is the point of compatibility. I think that this is a high time when we both in the European Union and USA and OECD should put our efforts together to draft that kind of a systems, both in technical and principle terms, that would apply accordingly in different parts of the world, and at least on the basis of a savings directive the new initiatives concerning tax evasion in the EU and the FATCA regulations in the United States. So, of course, the first point of view is the issue what we discussed quite lengthy already, and this is the automatic exchange of information. How do we ensure that all incomes from all sources and from all payers are automatically informed to the respective taxpayers' taxation administrations? One thing that has not been mentioned here yet is the process underway in the European Union, and I know discussed in the international level, and this is, I think, that we would need a duly international compatible taxpayer identification numbers, be it companies or be it individual people. And that certainly probably would facilitate the work of the different actors, the administrators, and that would be a security point from the perspective of taxpayers also. Then the second point what I would like to raise besides the automatic exchange of information is, of course, the need for high level of data protection and the need of the high level of the protection of the rights of the taxpayers themselves. Second point what I would, or actually third point what I would like to raise is then the extra actions what the Parliament called upon on its report. Firstly, could we agree globally, and to do it firstly in the EU base, on limited changes on the accounting and auditing directives and global regulation, so that then it would apply on international companies the principle of publish what you pay, so it could be easy to identify both the costs and incomes and taxes paid in the respective countries. My fourth point then would be the call or the urge on the common definition of tax havens and the development of the OECD code on the definition on tax havens to be more effective, and to have the next steps both in EU and global level on refraining and restraining the public sources of funding, be it a public procurement or any kind of subsidies for those companies that mainly act or quite strongly act or reside their monies on tax havens according to the definition. And that definition also would, of course, allow us ability in certain very severe cases to consider withdrawing the banking licenses of those banks that have been having their operations on those countries that are described as tax havens. And my last point is then the coordinated actions that comes to anti-money laundering. And I certainly would think it would be a high level of very beneficial on high level if we could agree in both sides of the Atlantic and then globally to have any tax fraud to be regarded as anti-money laundering and to be sanctions accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Pitcairn. I will make a first round of speakers representing all the political groups. Later on, I will give the floor back to the panelists, and we will move on again with the rest of the members. So now, on behalf of the Socialists, I will give the floor to Mrs. Elisa Ferreira.
Thank you very much, President. I'm not the rapporteur. Moitza Kleva. She'll join us later on, and thank you very much for your presentation. I had several questions, and the first one is going back to to the strategy in relation to the non-cooperative jurisdictions. Because if we just exchange between a small group of countries all the information, but if there is no strategy or a common move to block the operation of tax havens and non-cooperative jurisdictions, I think we will be penalising somehow the more transparent part of our society and leaving on the side the most opaque transactions. And so what is the way towards what is within OECD, within the G20, what is the strategy, and how strongly will the European Union and the jurisdictions involved, in particular the USA, how much pressure are you prepared to put into opening up this system of transparency and cooperation, bearing also in mind that the initial list of blacklist that was initially proposed by the OECD was then completely redrafted without a proper checking on the delivery of the recommendations, and so I think this is a major issue. My second question is more directed to Mr. Kermode as the representative of DG TaxSud, because I think it's important that we understand why it is not possible, or it has not been possible, recognising what you have mentioned, that we risk to split Europe in a set of bilateral agreements that probably won't fit, and of course internal exchange of information has got to be even stronger than external one, but wouldn't it be more effective that the EU would conclude an international agreement from the whole EU with the USA on the basis of Article 218 of the treaty, and so to guarantee that this coherence is totally fulfilled. And my last question to the Commission is about the details and the exact timetable for the documents or the proposals that you announced, in particular the revisited Administrative Cooperation Directive as well as the Savings Directive. So what is the exact timetable? And my last one is about the move towards some sort of similarity in accounting standards that really will be essential for a precise approach in what concerns the perception of transfer pricing and internationally, and on which dossier we have still a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Ferreira. On behalf of ALDE, will give the floor to Sophie in 't Veld, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd like to sort of refocus this debate, because this hearing is taking place very much at my request. I've been nagging for months to get it. It was actually not about fighting tax evasion and tax havens in general, because I think we are having that general debate, and there is a large consensus that we should fight tax evasion as something immoral, but this was actually about FATCA being a foreign law that is applied directly on EU territory and on EU citizens. Because let's be clear, this does not affect only US citizens, it affects EU citizens. It affects people who are married to an American, who have dual nationality, their children, people who may have regular business with the United States, who are studying there, or who may stay there, regularly for research purposes, for example. So it affects not only US citizens, it affects our citizens. And I ask this House, would we be as complacent if the Russian government is going to do the same, if the Chinese government is going to do the same? Are we not the master of our own legislative process? And I think that we should be a bit more critical and not just sign on the dotted line. And it may well be that we end up with a policy that is very much like FATCA. That may well be. But this is also very much about the democratic process. It is about parliamentary scrutiny. It is about our duty to defend the interests of our own citizens to begin with. So I'd like to refocus the debate on that aspect of things, namely the extraterritorial application of foreign law on our territory. I very much welcome the participation of the US administration and the OECD via the video link. I think this is an excellent use of modern technology. However, I do think it is a big missed opportunity that my suggestion for inviting the EDPS, the Data Protection Supervisor, was not taken up, because there are considerable data protection concerns here. And I think the EDPS should at the very least be consulted on any future European policies, but certainly if there are transatlantic agreements, whether they are bilateral between countries and the US or between the EU and the US, the EDPS should be consulted. As I said, fighting tax evasion, I think, is an objective that we all share. We don't need to debate that for very long. But I do not think, as a Democrat, that we should make policies by stealth. Policy laundering is no better than tax evasion, and we should also not bring in legislation through the back door of global fora. And in this respect, I'm very, very curious to finally, after 14 months of asking the European Commission, get access to the documents relating to the talks that have taken place between the European Commission and the US. Because frankly, from the first time I asked, early last year, the European Commission said, oh, well, we've hardly been in touch with the US because it doesn't really concern us, it's not our competence, it's member states, it's taxation. Then I would like to know, when I finally asked officially access to the documents, I find out that there are thousands of documents. Thousands. And if I, the documents, the few documents I got were made, were blacked out, with the exception of the page numbers, more or less. So we cannot even see whom you've been corresponding with, what you've been discussing. I see that there are letters sent to a US authority, agency, we don't even know which one, because the Commission doesn't want us to know, and this is about a potential transatlantic deal on data protection. So if this is also wonderful, Mr. Representative of the Commission, can we please today get the documents, full access to the documents? If you think it's all defensible, what you've been discussing, then please disclose all that information. You want citizens to disclose all their personal details. I think citizens have a right to know what you've been discussing. Because again, if we make legislation against tax evasion, it should be done in an open, transparent and democratic manner and subject to parliamentary scrutiny. And I also say to my colleagues, then we should also do our duty and not just sign on the dotted line, as I said before. A few more issues. Reciprocity. There's a lot of talk about reciprocity. I would like to know what that means in practice, quite frankly. I mean, is there real reciprocity in other areas where we've had transatlantic agreements? There's also this magic word, reciprocity. Well, in practice it doesn't exist. So I'd like to know how it's going to work. On the IGAs, apart from the fact that only a couple of countries have signed these agreements which have not entered into force, quite honestly, it doesn't solve the problem. It just shifts the problem. It shifts the burden away from the financial institutions, which is a good thing, because why would we burden them with, transferring data in an illegal manner? But the fact that there are agreements between member state governments and the US doesn't make the transfer legal. And I've actually happened to see an internal note of the European Commission where the Commission services themselves recognise that the transfer of data is a violation of EU law. So why has the Commission not presented this fact to us? Why have we not been discussing this? Because we want exchange of information. Yes, we want to fight tax evasion, but in a proper legal framework and with due regard of citizens' rights. Citizens should know what their rights are. So the IGAs are not the solution to the problem, and again I would like to propose to this committee that we officially ask the EDPS to analyse the IGAs and get a judgment on that. Then I think it has been said by various colleagues, and I very much agree, if there are to be any agreements, there should be a transatlantic agreement between the EU and the US, not vague and asymmetrical bilateral agreements which are not watertight. Then we want a proper mandate for the European Commission, and it should be possible, now that 2 countries have given up their veto, it should be possible to get a proper mandate. And finally, I do think the fact that we're in this situation, that we're actually welcoming the fact that third country laws on our territory is only the result of the weakness of the European Union. We only have ourselves to blame because we were unable to adopt our own policies. But again, the US may have fantastic, maybe FATCA is a great model, I don't know. We'll have to study it more closely. But it is about a principle. If Mr. Putin comes in and says, I have a Russian FATCA, in Cyrillic writing, are we going to to embrace it? If the Chinese government does the same, are we going to embrace it? Think not. So I think the democratic process is as important as the substance of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Intveld. Just one small remark, that the data protection is not a competence of this committee's competence, as you know, of the LIBE committee. So we are not so free to take decisions.
Well, sorry, Chair, this is a hearing, this is not legislation. We could have invited people who actually have something to say on the matter, and the transfer of data is a very important element of information exchange. So we want a legally watertight arrangement, and I think the opinion of the EDPS is going to be a crucial element in that debate.
Absolutely, yeah, fully agree with. Just to let my colleagues know that it's important to highlight that this committee is not competence of data protection. On behalf of the Greens, I will give the floor to Mr. Giegold.
Well, first of all, thanks to the participation and also the participation from the other side of the Atlantic. It's really an interesting and important moment to discuss this matter. And I must say, first of all, that Europe, and I agree with what Sophie in 't Veld said on this, has been complacent about tax evasion and tax avoidance, has not managed to put in credible solutions. Equally, the OECD has failed to do this, always because of the same problem, the consensus principle in this area. Therefore, we had basically in both institutions countries which were saving as a tax haven, at the same time blocking this, and therefore the US has now moved the strategy of not waiting for international agreements with actors who can't agree, but to put conditions on financial service providers in order to operate in the US or with US citizens. And that is a change of strategy which has opened up the possibility in order to now have real progress also in Europe. And I can only say, rather than blaming our friends on the other side of the Atlantic, we have to say thanks to America for this. Because now, because of this external factor, we get now serious on the matter. Of course, offshore leaks has helped, but that Austria and Luxembourg and others are now moving is because of the pressure which the US has used. And it's interesting to see that some of the opponents of real measures against tax evasion, transnational tax evasion in Europe, are now saying we need a EU 27 agreement with the US rather than any plurilateral agreement. And that's, of course, bringing back in the veto players which the US successfully managed to overcome. And of course we should prefer an EU 27 agreement. Of course we should be there, but we will only get to a strong EU 27 agreement if we have the pressure by the 5 countries plus others who are really willing to act, and then we will get to convincing agreements. Beyond that, I agree with a lot of the questions Sophie in 't Veld has asked, and we should take that seriously. But still, we should follow up the basic approach which the US has led with FATCA, because only this is leading us to any results. And we should be open. I studied in my study the history of fight against tax evasion. It started already during the League of Nations in the 1920s. Since then, we are struggling with tax evasion. And in Europe, we have not got anywhere. And therefore, I would like to see also from you, Sophie, the same level of emotion about data protection which you show on data protection, also on tax evasion. So if we would get the balance right, then we would agree with each other fully. Now some precise questions. Now precise, and never with the same political strength on this. Well, beyond that, I would like to ask a few questions to our colleague in the United States. Unfortunately, the detailed rules on the look-through approach in FATCA have not yet been published, according to my knowledge, and Sophie in 't Veld asked the question of reciprocity. I would like to know whether you will allow full reciprocity also in this respect, for instance, when it comes to corporations in Delaware and other US states, where basically you can open bank companies without revealing fully who is the beneficial owner. To me, it would be key to have there a full look-through approach. Will the US make that possible? A second question to the European Banking Federation. I was surprised to hear your statement and saying there are strong legal considerations because I must say your members were very much at the forefront in some of the member states to basically defend against automatic information exchange, also were active helpers in tax evasion, which is and I have not seen any public statement from your organisation to clear up with this past. So in order to be a credible interlocutor, could you clarify whether there will be any public statement, any research in your own association in order to research the history and present of active support of tax evasion by your members and also by your member federations? To the OECD, I would like to know what this new approach of automatic information exchange means to your failed approach of information exchange on request, which has prolonged for years the progress in this field. Will you give up on this approach and say now clearly and openly that this has led nowhere and we need to move to full automatic information exchange? To the Commission, I would like to know what is the precise timeline in the negotiations with third countries which you are planning, and I would also like to know what exactly your role is to support the 5 countries which are at the same time negotiating, as it seems, the pilot project. So this interrelationship I do not fully understand. Thank you.
Dankeschön, Herr Giegold. On behalf of the ECR, I will give the floor to Mr. Strejek.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, my speech will not be as emotional as Madame in 't Veld, but on the other hand, I understand majority of her remarks, and I may reassure you that China will not come up with Chinese FATCA in close future. I don't think so. Well, thank you very much, all speakers, for your remarks, and above all, Madam Rosval, your position is something which I take very seriously in this debate. Above all, the two remarks that were your conclusions and that are in a hidden form, as I understand, quite a sort of warning for legislators, and I appreciate. Let me raise a few questions. FATCA is likely well-meant project that may evolve into monster, which will become a hurdle to cross-border economic activities. Maybe somebody from the European Commission may answer this question. This is my worry. I understand what is behind, what is the aim, but on the other hand, we should take into account that economic growth, economic activity shouldn't be jeopardized by something which is called FATCA. The second question, FATCA may stimulate space conducive for increasing red tape or more bureaucracy, which will cost something. And Madam Rosval, if I can ask you, you may say more on this subject. I totally share Madam in 't Veld's worries on protection of personal data, which I absolutely share. I am on your side in this position, and maybe Mr. Kermode from the European Commission may say more. And the last question that I'd like to raise is what in fact is the position of Ministers of Finance in the ECOFIN committee? Has already been this proposal discussed in the ECOFIN, and what is the position inside this committee? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Strejek. I will give now the floor to Mr. Stack via video conference. So, Mr. Stack, if you want to comment what my colleagues said, please. Mr. Stack, I don't know whether Mr. Stack left. So meanwhile, I will give the floor to Mr. Pross, that I'm afraid is not available either. Mr. Stack, can you listen to us? Mr. Stack?
Yes.
Yeah, I would like to give you the floor now to comment on what my colleagues said. Can you?
Yes. I apologize. I lost the connection, but just for the last minute or two. So I believe I've been keeping track of most of the good questions that have been posed. First, in connection with the speed of implementation of FATCA, as we've mentioned, we are actively in discussions with over 75 jurisdictions. But to the representative of the European Banking Federation, we would suggest it could be beneficial for them to work with their own countries to get their governments to talk to us, because we're ready to make progress quickly with others. Can I be heard okay? Because I'm seeing I have a video issue.
Yes. Yeah, we can listen to you perfectly.
Okay, fine. And by the way, on the issue of speed, I would simply note that the first reporting of information is not until September 15, 2015. So we are aware of the deadlines. We're working very closely with countries and financial institutions to put this into play in an efficient manner. Second, I'd like to address the issue of involving global jurisdictions so that this problem simply doesn't move from the compliant jurisdictions to non-compliant jurisdictions. And that is a key element of the FATCA approach. And in order to implement this approach, the United States has put its markets on the line. It is saying to jurisdictions, if you want to invest in the U.S. market under our own laws, you need to come in and have an agreement with us so that we can catch U.S. residents and citizens who are keeping accounts in their banks. And this has proven a very successful way to get these jurisdictions to come in and talk with us. And I believe that the world will be delighted to see the jurisdictions that at the end of the day we will have signed jurisdictions agreements with. Third, if I may, on the extraterritorial point, simply because it relates to the last point I made, I believe the members here present today and the participants understand that the United States put its market at risk in doing FATCA. It did not impose its law extraterritorially. It said to jurisdictions, if you'd like to continue to invest in the U.S. stock and bond markets in different ways, we are going to expect you to take some steps to help us find tax evaders. And while I'm on that point, we are all aware that this tax evasion hurts every country in the world, particularly in times of austerity, when if these people are not paying their taxes, the burden falls on others in the country who are honest and law-abiding. But we did it in a way that said, you are welcome to come into our financial system if you abide by these rules and enter an agreement. And finally, on reciprocity, we would simply point out that under our IGAs that are reciprocal, the IRS agrees to exchange information on interest, dividends, and other income that it already collects, which is substantial, and in some cases more extensive than what has to be reported under FATCA. The U.S. recognizes the importance of reaching equivalent levels of exchange under our law that we are getting from other jurisdictions. And the administration has included in its budget proposal a provision that would permit U.S. financial institutions to make such equivalent exchanges. Under the U.S. political system, different from some parliamentary systems, we need to work that through Congress, but we are committed to doing that. Once we've done that, to go to the question on beneficial ownership in Delaware, once we have equivalent levels of exchange, we would expect our own financial institutions would be required to look through entities and report on individuals just as non-U.S. institutions are required to do under our IGAs. Thank you very much. I hope I covered most of the questions I was hearing throughout.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stack. Now I will give the floor, if available, to Mr. Pross of the OECD. Mr. Pross, are you available? I think we lost it, so I will give the floor to Mr. Kermot, and in case we recover later Mr. Pross, we will give him back the floor. So, Mr. Kermot, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. If I can run through what I understood to be questions that were either directly or indirectly addressed to me as representative of the Commission. Firstly, maybe I could take up the point about the compatibility of different systems, which was one of the first questions, that is the compatibility of different automatic information exchange systems. We think this is a very important point, and we think that because of the differences in tax systems around the world, it's one that we have to pay considerable attention to. For instance, the information that the United States would require covers a different category of persons than that which our member states would require, i.e. there is a difference between taxation based on essentially citizenship and that based on residence. There was an issue also raised on the question of TINs, so-called taxpayer identification numbers, and the Commission is hard at work on this at this moment in time. as you may know, at the end of last year, with the action plan that the Commission adopted against fraud and tax evasion, it included at the same time the opening of a so-called tin on the web, which was designed to assist in the identification and use of taxpayer identification numbers. We have since followed this up with public consultation, with further ongoing work, precisely to strengthen the base for automatic exchange of information. The issue of the amendment, or the possible amendment of the accounting directives, was also mentioned, and here, as you know, Commissioner Barnier has indicated that he considers this to be an important issue to go forward with following the conclusions of the European Council of last week. So I think we can expect something pretty quickly on that. In fact, one of the precise questions concerns the timeline for both any proposal on that and on the modification of the Administrative Cooperation Directive to which I referred earlier. And certainly when it comes to the Administrative Cooperation Directive, we would expect to have a proposal on the table in the next weeks. It's not a question of months now, it's a question of doing it as quickly as possible in June. I would imagine that the accounting issue will be given a similar degree of urgency at this point in time. The question of data protection was raised in a more general way by one of the first speakers, and it is an issue that has given us considerable concern over all of the discussions and the following of the different developments on this file over the years. But maybe I could come back to that in response to the specific questions asked by Mrs. in 't Veld. There was a point about the risks of having bilateral agreements and a split, and whether or not that would cause difficulties. Certainly within the EU, this is not what we would want to see. Definitely not. And this is precisely the reason that we are now proposing to come forward very quickly with a modification of the Mutual Assistance Directive, precisely to put an EU framework around it and to avoid a situation of a proliferation of individual agreements within the EU as Member States try to respond to the application of the most favoured nation clause in the Mutual Assistance Directive, which can be called into question as soon as a Member State gives a third country better treatment than it does to other Member States. The issue was also raised of whether or not it would be better to have, looking outwards, a single EU, say US treaty or EU other country treaty. Clearly, the idea of having a treaty where the EU can leverage its political and economic weight is extremely important, and indeed we have such treaties in the tax area with Switzerland and other jurisdictions under the existing savings agreement, albeit they do not cover automatic exchange of information yet. I think there is certainly it's certainly a positive thing to look at. The difficulty, and here I come to further questions that were asked, is that at the time when FATCA was originally put on the table, this was not envisaged as a form of information exchange. This was precisely put on the table as an American provision designed to ensure that American taxpayers paid their dues. Now, we in the Commission have absolutely no problem with the principle behind this, and we have no problem with the idea of tax administrations helping each other. But in the discussions that the Commission was involved with the American Treasury and with our Member States and with representatives of the banking industry, our aim from the beginning, in the absence of a clear mandate to negotiate on the part of the EU, was to try and ensure that the arrangements that the Americans wished to put in place would in fact come around to a form of information exchange between tax administrations based on the principles that we think are more appropriate to information exchange between cooperating jurisdictions, also to ensure that the data protection aspects could be integrated into the double taxation treaties that Member States have. Indeed, we were concerned that the original FATCA model, and indeed the model that is still known as Model 2, would be one that would not be appropriate for cooperation between jurisdictions who had trust in each other. But also it was important to protect the rights both of our financial institutions and of the people who were being reported on. The question was asked about reciprocity. What does it mean? Well, for us, reciprocity, clearly in the context of our savings directive, for instance, means that you give people what they have to give you. And clearly, listening to what our American colleague had to say a few moments ago, their declaration of intent on this, I think, is very important. We would expect, if there is to be a global standard, that it would be one based on a reciprocal relationship, that there would be an interest for both sides. I come to the issue raised by Mrs. in 't Veld on the question of transparency, in particular the access to documents. I cannot give you a formal reply today, as your appeal is actually with the Secretary-General of the Commission, but what I can say is that we have not sought to hide what we have done. In the discussions that we had with the US and with some Member States, and indeed with all Member States at some stages, we were in the position of trying to ensure that a good result, based on what I have just said, could come about. We explored, indeed, the data protection issue, and it was clear to us what the potential problems were on the data protection side, and we had advised all of our Member States on the restrictions that they have to apply. For instance, we were quite clear on the need for a domestic legal basis in order to collect and process information. We were clear on the need for proportionate information. We were also clear on the questions of right of access and redress, and the whole question of the independent supervision of data at the other end of the chain. Now, these are issues that we feel are more properly built into the context of standard double taxation treaties between different treaty partners. And indeed, I think you can draw some solace from the fact that these arrangements of information on request have themselves been built on the double tax treaties between different jurisdictions. I think the question of whether or not there should be an EU-US agreement I have covered. It was also a question I think that Ms. in 't Veld raised. I think in the longer term this must certainly be an interesting possibility. I say that with half an eye on what the American side has said itself about their commitment to further discussions, both in a global context with the OECD and the EU where appropriate, on building better standards for the world in general. So there may well be scope going forward. But as you are all aware, we have essentially had a problem within the EU for many years now of not having a common approach on full automatic exchange of information. Without that common understanding between our Member States, it is very difficult for us to present ourselves to the outside world for a full automatic exchange of information solution. But I think, as was mentioned, things seem to be moving quite fast now, and we are encouraged by the possibility that with all Member States fully committed to automatic exchange of information, our negotiating position as a collective, as a group, would indeed be much stronger. The question of the timeline was raised by Mr. Giegold. I think I may have partly replied to that. The timeline is very short as far as we're concerned for the proposals that we are going to put on the table. The timeline for the negotiations with third countries, on the other hand, in the context of the savings agreement, will depend on how these countries react. All I can say at the moment is letters have been written and sent to these jurisdictions. We are having first contacts now, and we as the Commission will be pushing hard for solutions as quickly as possible. We have no firm end date for this, but we believe that it has to go fast now. It has to go as fast as possible. Do we support the G5, and what does it mean? Well, we support the principles, but we wish to put around this the framework of an EU discussion. And in order to do this, we are putting on the table shortly a draft directive on extending the Mutual Assistance Directive. I think you should not see this as a competition. At least we would not want to see this as a competition between competing standards. We understood that the letter that was signed by the 5 Member States as being a declaration of intent to go further on automatic exchange of information and precisely to put it into an EU framework. So we have discussed with the 5, we have discussed with our Member States in general, all 27 together, and we would hope to bring this further in the next period, in the next certainly in the next months and hopefully before the end of the year, see much more clearly how this can work in practice. But I think that what will put a framework around this will be the draft directive that we are proposing. Finally, there were two questions. One on will FATCA become a monster? I sincerely hope not. I genuinely hope it won't. Will it damage the economy? Well, if it's designed cleverly and implemented cleverly, it should not. But I think we must always be conscious of the way these systems are used so that they are used to their maximum effect. And I think one of the things that we as a union can bring to the table in the OECD and in discussions in other fora is the experience we have, be it good or bad, on the use of information under the savings regime. And I think that this can help us to build something that will help both developing and developed countries. Finally, again, there were concerns about the data protection issue. I think I have dealt with some of those. The data protection issue remains an issue that we will be concentrated on and where we will be watching with our member states. We would like to think that this is the beginning of a process rather than an end, and we are conscious of how difficult it has been for our member states to implement the Savings Directive in its time, and how important it is for the Savings Directive amending proposal to be adopted as quickly as possible now to ensure that the system, that the loopholes we've already seen in the system can be filled. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Kermot. I'm going to give the floor back to Mr. Pross from the OCDE. Yes, we are running really out of time. Do you mind if I give you the floor at the end?
Okay, just to say that there is one element that the Commission did not answer to, and that is the situation of, let's say, not only US citizens but also European citizens or people with dual nationality who are affected by this. Where can they turn to? Who is going to protect their rights? I would like to know from the Commission.
Does the Commission want to answer?
Well, Chair, I think the answer to that question is that in a situation where you have a bilateral agreement entered into between one jurisdiction in the EU and the United States, it is then a matter for the administration and the government of that member state to protect the rights of its citizen. And I come back to the point I was trying to make earlier about the difference between a situation where you have the original FATCA or the Model 2 arrangement, where you have no essential barrier between the financial institution and the American Internal Revenue Service, and this system where you pass by a treaty-based arrangement.
Sorry, I mean, we cannot make a bilateral debate. Sorry for that, Sophie. I will give the floor now to Mr. Pross, that is from the OCDE. As we are running out of time, I would appreciate if the panelists could speak during 3 minutes maximum, please. Mr. Pross. Mr. Pross, can you listen to us?
Follow the discussion in the last 15 minutes because of technical reasons. I have noted two questions that are linked and I'm happy to address them. I think there was one question as to whether the OECD would now give up its standard information exchange upon request. I think I'd briefly answer this by also referring to some of the earlier statements from one of the other panelists, Mr. Mike Lewis, I think, to make the important point that while automatic exchange is important and certainly there's a lot of interest in taking this forward also within the OECD, it is not the only form in which tax administration should cooperate to effectively address offshore tax evasion and in fact avoidance. There's other forms, there's information on request, there's spontaneous information, there's simultaneous tax audits, there's other forms, and I think we shouldn't engage in a discussion of one versus the other. We should see this as a comprehensive package if we want to get to solutions. I may just add that also even in the context of automatic exchange, there might need to be follow-up requests in order to further investigate a particular case about which you have been informed by the information delivered automatically. So I don't think this is a question of either or. I think we need a holistic, we need a comprehensive approach. In that comprehensive approach, I think we will have information upon request. We should also not forget that this has been a success. We have 120 countries. We've made 600 recommendations. 300 recommendations have been followed by countries around the world. All the countries that you typically associate with tax havens are in there. They're following the recommendations, and where they don't, there's a clear reporting also back to the G20. So that's to say, I think, on the information and request and also its relationship to automatic exchange. A last point, which was a related question, was asked about how is this a standard on automatic exchange going to happen, and there I think I can just briefly read to you the G20 statement from April, where it clearly says that we expect this to be the standard, and urge all jurisdictions to move towards exchanging information automatically with their treaty partners as appropriate. And you will certainly also recall that the G20 made an important contribution in connection with the standard on information upon request at the meeting in April, and the Global Forum that was restructured as a result of the efforts of the G20 and, of course, the OECD, and with the support of the EU here. So those two brief answers to the questions I was able to understand. I apologize that I did not perhaps hear some of the other questions, but unfortunately there was no reception. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pross. I will give now the floor to Mr. Luis.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try to be brief. And I would just say, in terms of what Mr. Prost has said, our enthusiasm for other forms of information exchange shouldn't be taken to read that we think that automatic is useful for well-developed tax authorities, and that other tax authorities might be better sticking with on request. It's important that we have a level playing field for everybody. In terms of the question about how do we ensure that all income and all sources and all payers are covered, one of the useful things in the US FATCA model is a detailed set of due diligence procedures to establish the beneficial ownership of accounts and looking through particularly corporate and other legal entities. I think it's still important to stress that whatever deal comes out of either the G5 deal or expanded union-wide deal, that it includes similar kinds of detailed due diligence procedures of that kind. Now, obviously, those carry costs, compliance costs and burdens, and Madam Roosevelt will talk more about them, I'm sure. But that's where there's read across to things like the revision of the fourth money laundering directive. It's interesting that parts of the banking industry, for example, have been supportive of public registries of the beneficial ownership of corporate and legal entities for precisely this reason, to reduce compliance costs of doing kind of know your customer money laundering checks. There's a similar argument, I think, about having robust and potentially public registries of beneficial ownership to help with FATCA-type compliance as well. In terms of which jurisdictions will be brought within the gambit of a global FATCA, potentially, the comments by committee members about bringing secrecy jurisdictions in is extremely important. And it's there that there's important work, we think, going on with the action plan and at member state level also, both to define tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions and to define common measures, sticks as well as carrots, to bring those kinds of jurisdictions into the ambit of these kinds of deals. And then just finally to talk very briefly about the data protection issues that have been raised, which are extremely serious, of course, and involve issues of fundamental human rights. One thing to say is that, as Mr. Commode said, that we're not starting from scratch in addressing some of these issues, that there have already been, both on request and